I don't know if you can really fully appreciate what it is to be able to preach on an event or in an event like this beside Brother Holland. It's just such an honor, really, for me. I have this theory that there are times in your young life when a window opens up in your psyche, when you are unusually or uniquely open to influences of those who you're around, and whoever you happen to be associating with at that point, you're going to be more heavily influenced. And perhaps right now you can think about people who have influenced you or who did when you were young. Well, my window was open at the time that I went to Freed Hardeman and sat at the feet of Brother Holland. And I was just thinking, people who hear him preach today feel as I do about the gratitude for what he's done in the kingdom and this kind of preaching. And yet, that by itself is short-sighted, because there are so many of us who were or are young preachers, so influenced by his work. So many of us who would write those early sermons and think, now, how would Brother Holland say this? And we'd want to be like him. I never grew out of that, and I just love and appreciate him so very much. I say that when I'm around him, and I'm sure that I embarrass him, but I still do it, so that's okay. Let's talk about marriage. I want to present one concept in this session, which once adopted will revolutionize, I think, all of our marriages. It will make a bad marriage better. It will make a great marriage even better. And it's so profound yet so simple because it's from the Word of God. Love is not merely an emotion in the Scriptures. It's a command. Now just get your mind wrapped around that. In Ephesians 5:25, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. It's a command. It's a requirement. And so Titus chapter 2 and verse 4, the wives are commanded to love their husbands. Isn't that interesting? Now love is love is kind of like electricity. You can't see electricity, you only observe what it does. So it is with love. In fact, you can tell somebody that you love them, but if they don't see it in the way that you treat them, they're not going to believe it. We identify love by what we see. In Ephesians 5:25, you have the word love that is a familiar word to you, a Greek word, agape. What may interest you is that in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that love chapter, that's the same root word, agape, in Ephesians 5:25, agapo, but it's the same root word, the same basic Greek word. So when husbands are commanded to love their wives in Ephesians 5:25, if you want to know what that's like, you just go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Now you're familiar with this, and he's not writing about marriage in this chapter. 1 Corinthians 13 is in a triad of chapters on spiritual gifts. And during the first century, God saw fit to endow people, Christians, with miraculous abilities. That was important to launch the infant church. We don't need it now. If we did, we'd have it, but I suppose if we had it, we'd mess it up like they did. They had all sorts of troubles with miraculous gifts. And so you have these three chapters. Right in the middle, the love chapter is about the problems that came into the early church as a result of bad attitudes about spiritual gifts. Having said that, though, this is a chapter about love. It's a general chapter on the principles of love with a specific application, which is the church and spiritual gifts. What I want to do in this session is to take the qualifications, or the qualities, I should say, of love from 1 Corinthians 13, and let's make them applicable to our marriages. I mean by that, you might look at this and say, why, look, I know 1 Corinthians 13. I'm familiar with that. I'm a Christian. I've read that. I understand that passage. Yeah, but here's the question. Now, do you make it apply to your marriage? Have you ever specifically applied it to your marriage? My conviction is that the best husband in the world, are you ready for this? Is a faithful Christian. The best wife in the world is a faithful Christian. You want to be a great spouse? Go back to the New Testament, the basic principles of just being a Christian, and I'm telling you, you'll be a great spouse. So here they are. 1, love suffers long and is kind. This business of long suffering is pretty interesting. You know what long suffering means? It means to suffer long. You'll never find a great marriage without a lot of patience involved in that. The reason is that you married a human being. There are so many things over which you could get really stressed out about that require not sinful things, but characteristics, things that your husband does, that your wife does, that deserve or require your patience. Are you patient in your home? Are you patient with your spouse? Now, you've got to understand something, that patience is not just first a matter of marriage and get along in our marriages. Patience is something that came with being a Christian. So in Ephesians chapter 1, Paul says, or chapter 4, verse 1, he said, I therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, beseech you that you walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you are called, with all lowliness and meekness and long-suffering, forbearing one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. Do you know how you keep the church united? Listen to me. You've got to be long-suffering. Why is that true? It's because we're human beings. We're diverse, we're different, and sometimes we have qualities about us, characteristics that are a bit uncomfortable to other people. Is that true? It's true in the church. Well, it's true in your marriage too. The wife says, Why does my husband keep getting his chair confused with his closet? Why does he put his... And a husband says to his wife, why is it that when you're alone at the house at night that all the lights are on? Don't you know that electricity is expensive? And I come in the house and it's all lit up like a Christmas tree. And are there things, why can't I reach you on your cell phone? Why don't you keep this charged? You have things right now in your marriage that are a little annoying to you? Do you love him? Do you love her? Love requires patience. It's not merely a requirement for marriage, it's a requirement for being a Christian. Be a faithful Christian, you'll be a great spouse. And is kind. I will be kind to you. Brother Holland talked about kindness a while ago. I don't see how you can have a good marriage without kindness. Are you kind? Do you interrupt your spouse? Make a habit of that? When we first married, we made a practice of being a lot kinder, I think. And then the years rolled on, and why do you teach your children to be polite? You do, don't you? You teach your grandchildren to be polite. Why is that? It's not because you want them to be able to be in a higher level of society. That's not the reason you do that. You do that because you want them to not think so much of themselves all the time. I want to think about the comfort of others. Kindness. I'm going to challenge you to do this. I challenge you to try to outdo your spouse on kindness. What it will do is create, by the way, a fertile atmosphere in which your spouse can be all that he or she can be in marriage. But the fact of the matter is, remember that your marriage is a triangle, not just a straight line. A straight line would be, it's between my wife and me, straight line. But of course you don't live like that. You live in a triangle. So it's me and it's God and it's my spouse. I need to think of it that way because I'm going to be judged one day by the kind of spouse I am. Are you kind? Ephesians 4:32 we read a while ago, be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving. Wait a minute, that's not about marriage, it's about being a Christian. But it's applicable to marriage. Be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. Are you hard to live with? Be kind. Here's the next one. Love doesn't envy. You say, well, man, how does this apply to marriage? Well, I believe that it does, and particularly to those of us who study the Bible, who understand the different roles in marriage. You suppose that it's ever the case that a husband will envy his wife's role in the home? I got to go to work every day and work the long hours, and here you are, all you have to do is take care of these children, take care of this family. That's all you do. Right? Or maybe a wife would envy her husband. Here, I take care of I take care of the home. I do these things. And look at you. You have a wonderful life. You get to go off and you have this big position and people respect you and you blah, blah, blah. I wish I was like you. And wait a minute. We start talking like that and we get into real trouble. You women would make terrible men. You're not designed to be a man, you know. You men would make terrible women. And ugly to boot, wouldn't you? You're not supposed, you know what? God made you in the way that He did with a purpose in mind. I'm amazed when I'm around a mother who's taking care of her children and the kind of patience and this business about being a multitasker. Why do you suppose God made women like that? It's because of the maternal needs. It's because that's what would be necessary for her to raise those babies. And men aren't so much like that, are they? We do one thing at the time. We do one thing at a time. We're more black and white in our sense of logic. And I don't mean that women aren't logical. I just mean that we're different. Love doesn't envy. I'm not going to envy your position. God made us different, and He did so with a purpose in mind. And I love and appreciate what you do. The other day I was in worship. And I was listening I wasn't preaching on that Sunday. We were on vacation somewhere, and we stopped to worship with a wonderful church of people. And this mother of twin babies knew us. I don't remember knowing her, but she felt that she knew us very well, and so she gave each of us one of the babies to keep during worship. And I ate the Lord's Supper, Brother Holland, holding a baby. I don't know how long it's been since you have done that, but that's hard to do. I mean, it's really hard to do. And when the worship was over, I had stains on my suit, some of which I couldn't identify. Love does not envy. I don't want to be, if I'm the wife, I don't want to be the husband. I don't want to domineer you. I don't want to be the leader. C.S. Lewis wrote and said that in marriage you can't have two leaders. If you have two equal leaders in marriage and you confront a real and important decision and you disagree, then you've hit an impasse and the thing blows up. You've got to have someone to make those decisions, somebody to be the leader, somebody to be the head. And what we need is a wife who says, I love you and I don't envy your position. I'm happy being what I am. And a husband who looks to his wife and says, I love you, I don't envy your position. I love being what I am. Here's the next one. It doesn't parade itself and it's not puffed up. King James says, doesn't vaunt itself. It literally means one is not inflated with his own importance. How do you like that? Puffed up. What happens when you inject this into marriage? What happens when you inject it into the eldership? You look at 1 Timothy chapter 3 and the qualifications of elders, and what you find is that you have this sort of redundant, repetitive idea about his personality. He can't be a man with a short temper. He can't be a man who's a striker, who's looking for a fight. A man with this kind of domineering personality that he's always. What happens this is in marriage too. So what happens when you have a person in the marriage and he or she is vaunting himself or herself? It's puffed up. How does it show itself? Well, I always have to be right. Let me tell you something. In first place, you're not always right. In the second place, sometimes you're right and you don't need to prove it. You just need to leave it alone because you're going to hurt your spouse. They drive it harder and harder and harder until you win the point. But you lose the game. Pride is what makes us be like that. The other day, Mrs. Colley has a very difficult time with her cell phone. I think I said something about that earlier. Maybe I'm thinking about it. I had a friend, a coworker who said one day, Glenn, I know what to do about Cindy's cell phone. You have this problem. She won't keep it with her and keep it charged. You can't reach her. But the reason is that you haven't bought her one of those smartphones. See, he said, that's what I did with mine. I bought her a smartphone. And now she keeps up with it. I can reach her anytime I want now because I spent the money on one of those fancy, it's got email and all sorts of things. And now I can reach her. That's what you got to do. You think it'll work? I said, yeah, it'll work. It'll work. So I did it. I bought her a smartphone. It didn't work. The other day, I couldn't reach her. So I texted her, please, please, keep your phone with you and charged where I can reach you, because I needed to talk to her and I couldn't reach her. Please. So I didn't do it in caps or anything. I wasn't shouting it, but please. I put 2 pleases. That was pretty strong. And as soon as I finished texting it, I sent it. I was at my office desk and I laid the phone down, and my coworker said, Glenn, we got to go to lunch right now. A man's waiting on us. Okay, I'm coming. And I went right out the door and left that phone right there on that desk. And that's where it was laying when she responded to that text. If you're puffed up in your marriage, what happens is you don't apologize. You just seldom, if ever, apologize. You'll never have a great marriage without the ability to apologize. You know, back to Ephesians 4:32, be kind, tender-hearted, forgiving one another. You've got to be able to apologize. And when you apologize to your spouse, I don't want an apology that's stamped Hong Kong on the bottom. It's no good, you know. Anytime you need to apologize, make it a good one. The best apology, I suppose, you'll ever read or hear about is in Luke chapter 15 when the prodigal came home. And remember, his father ran out to meet him and he said, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in thy sight. How did he know he had sinned against heaven? Because his daddy had taught him that. I've sinned against heaven and in thy sight. I'm no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. You know what? He didn't offer mitigating circumstances. I suppose he could have, you know. He could have said, I'm really sorry, Dad, but of course you just don't know how it is to live with my older brother. Or he could have said, but your rules. Daddy, I'm sorry, but your rules drive me crazy. Or he could have said, I love you, Daddy, and I'm sorry and everything, but my friends, you know, everybody was going that way and it just seemed like the right, but he didn't argue any of those mitigating circumstances. And we, you know, because that's what we do in our marriages. We have this tiff with our spouse, a little fuss, you know, and I say, well, I just want to say that I'm sorry. But I only said it because you said, if you're going to apologize, and sometimes you should, I want you to make it clean. Do a good job of it. The opposite of that is what's talked about in this passage. When I'm puffed up in my marriage, what happens is I'm mostly concerned about my own comfort. You'll never have a great marriage if you can't get off that. See, marriage is about unselfishness. It's about having another person with whom I've become one. Which is the greatest relationship, would you say, of which humans are capable? Would it be husband, wife, or mother to her son? Oh, the answer is husband and wife. Only in reference to this relationship does the Bible say 2 people become one flesh. But part of that means that I've got to be unselfish. You won't make it work without unselfishness. Being puffed up says I'm more concerned about my comfort than yours. Being married in a great marriage means the opposite of that. I care about what's comfortable to you. I care about making you comfortable. Does not behave itself unseemly. I want you to watch the way that you talk. Colossians 4:6, remember. Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt. Salt. You know, salt is what makes food taste bad when it's not on it. Speech ought to be like. Don't you think it's interesting that in this passage, when he talks about our speech, that he doesn't go ahead and give you a list of all the bad words? I mean, you know, the Bible would explicitly prohibit blasphemy against God and those things which would be blasphemous. But then there's a whole list of words that you would not use, and you wouldn't use them certainly in good company. You wouldn't do that. And why is that? The Bible doesn't list those words, and the answer is because of Colossians 4 and verse 6. Because your speech is to be with grace and seasoned with salt. There are things that I would not say, words that I will not use because of that. And to do so would be, are you ready for this? Unseemly. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to flirt with the waitress. Flirt with your wife. I'm not going to call the waitress honey. Call your wife honey. Because that's unseemly. There are matters of politeness that I'm going to practice around my spouse, maybe which I practiced when we were young and I've just gotten out of the habit of doing those things, but I need to do them. And the opposite of that, or to treat one another with rudeness, is unseemly. And love does not behave itself unseemly. Next, seeks not her own. I want to divide this one because this was sort of similar to one earlier. Seeks not her own. I want to divide it into two major categories. I want to show you two places where this is particularly applicable. It's applicable to our finances. I have this theory that problems with money in marriage are not about how much we have or don't have. And I base that on the fact that I know some wonderful couples who have been married a long time and have done so very successfully. They have wonderful marriages who've had very little money. Very little. They live very meager lives. What a great marriage. I've known people who had lots of money, at least by my standard, that I would consider lots of money, who have very unhappy marriages. It's not about how much money you have. What is it then? When do we have conflict in our marriages because of money? Ready? It's when one partner or the other feels that selfishness has elbowed its way into the marriage. It's about selfishness. That's always true. I can't seek my own. Your wife standing at the window, looking out. You're coming home from work, and there's a boat behind your truck. You come in and she says, "What's the boat? What are you doing with the boat?" "You're not going to believe this. I bought the boat." I bought the boat. I bought it from my boss. He came and that boat was worth $5,000. I got it for a steal. I mean, he was ready to get freed of it, and I negotiated that. I made a great deal. I bought that thing for $3,000. Can you believe it? Of course, I bought it for you, really. I did. Bought it, and she says, "Well, honey, where'd you get the money for the boat?" And he says, "Well, I got it out of our savings account. I just took it out of savings. But we were saving that money for a new truck, a down payment on a new truck, because your truck's worn out. And we got to buy a truck." And you know, when you got trouble in marriage over money, it's when selfishness comes in, right? What I urge couples to do is to create a budget, particularly in the young years. Create a budget, and then part of that ought to be an agreement on amount of money. This amount is how much we can spend without talking to the other. This amount of money outside of the budget, unique expenditure, we can spend this much without picking up the phone and calling the other and saying, "What do you think about this?" And when you live within those boundaries, if you have this kind of communication and you don't violate that, then you'll protect yourself from this one, because I can tell you that what is characteristic of love is that she doesn't seek her own. I understand the fact that the husband is the head of the wife. I understand that he's the leader of the family. And yet that's not prideful. That's a role that he plays because God created him to do it and he put it on his shoulders. That's his responsibility, but it's not a prideful thing. This isn't because he looks at himself as being a king and she's the maid. That's not it. He's fulfilling a necessary role. And he doesn't seek his own. The decisions that you will make as a man are based on what would glorify God the most and what would be the best for your family, not what would I selfishly like. You do that and you'll poison your marriage. You see, because love does not seek her own. Here's the next one. It's not easily provoked. The New King James says provoked. The Old King James says easily provoked. And the idea is you get a dog with his hackles up. And you know, hackles, that's that hair on the back of his neck. And when he gets angry, his hackles go up, and we use that term. When he gets his hackles up, the skin on his mouth, around his teeth, pulls back and he exposes his teeth and his gums, and that's what this word means. Or a cat, she gets riled, and you look at her paws and the skin pulls back from her claws, and that's what this word means. To be easily provoked means that, well, it means just that. You can imagine how it would be to be married to somebody like that. What happens is that you break down communication. I become, and it could be the wife or it could be the husband. It could be, but I tell you what, you break down communication. I am nervous about being open or vulnerable in my communication with you because I don't want to tip you over. You may, well, you know the different levels of communication. The frivolous level, hey, how you doing? How you doing? Fine. The factual level between people who are co-workers and should I order this? Should I order that? Here's what you do. It's factual. The fellowship level that we have when we eat together in the church, we just talk and chatter and we tell stories about our lives. Then the feeling level, that's a little higher. The friendship level, that kind of closeness, and we share a bit of ourselves. But the top one is the freedom level. And the freedom level is reserved for husbands and wives. It's the level where you are open to discuss your feelings or your dreams or your fears, your aspirations, all of that. You just want, because you have that oneness with that. And it's terribly vulnerable. You know why people who have very bitter divorces, why the darkness is in it? It's because in marriage, I create a vulnerability. You can't have real love without being vulnerable to the other person. And that other person then has the ability to hurt you in a way that nobody else can because you've opened yourself up this way. It's a wonderful and awful thing. It's a wonderful thing because it makes love possible in marriage. But it's vulnerable. It's vulnerable. Easily provoked is a word when applied to marriage, which means that the ability to communicate, the freedom level of communication is not going to be there because I can't. I don't know how you will respond. And you and I are responsible for what we say, whether or not we're angry. And you and I are going to stand before God and give an account for the way that we've treated our spouses, based on the principles, at least by and large, on the principles of faithful Christianity. Again, this list is not about marriage, it's about being a Christian, and part of it is not easily provoked, thinks no evil. That's a bookkeeper's term, and it literally means to keep an account. Had a man come into my office one day with his wife, and they had some problems, and sat down, and so first I like to meet with people together, and then separate them, talk. I said, all right, to him, all right, tell me what the problem is. Tell me what's going on. And he reached in his pocket and he pulled out a little book, and he opened it, and he had kept a detailed record of everything she had said to him over the last several months that was offensive to him, that made him mad. And he had dates and times. He had it, and he began to read it. And it didn't take me long to know where we had, this was a major problem, and that's exactly what this passage is referencing when it says, thinks no evil. Look, you want to have a great marriage, you better be good at forgiving. And when something has been repented of and your spouse asks for forgiveness, you've got to turn loose of that. You've got to turn loose of it because of the golden rule. You don't want to be treated that way. You know why we do this in arguments with our spouses? It's because, we're having this argument, this dispute, and maybe I feel like I'm losing this argument. And so I would reach back into history and say, yeah, well, I remember when you did this. I remember. What you did 6 months ago, that was a lot worse than what I did now. So you're a lot worse. You're worse than me. And is there ever a time when it would be appropriate to rehearse history about wrongs in a marriage? I think there's only one. There is, but it's only one. And that would be when there's a pattern of sin going on in a marriage, and the only way you can establish that this is a pattern is by rehearsing the history. But otherwise, and we're not talking about that in this point. What I'm talking about is day in, day out things. And I'm saying to you that you ought to treat your spouse the way that you want to be treated in love, thinks no evil. Here's the next one. It doesn't rejoice in iniquity, but it rejoices in the truth. Honey, I vow to you that I'll work to have a truly Christian home. What that means is that we're not going to have any kind of entertainment in our home that is a violation of the Word of God. We're not going to have any entertainment in our home which we would be nervous about having going on or participating in when the Lord returns, right? Got to have strict rules about the movies that you watch. Got to have strict rules about the television that you watch. And let's just go ahead and realize and admit that The vast majority of the stuff that's produced today makes hell shoot fireworks in celebration because it's evil. We're just not going to watch the garbage. We've got to keep it out of our house. What I want is a Christian home. That's what we've got to have. It means that things are not going to be as important as people in our home and our relationships. We'll never put things above those. We're going to put the Lord first. We'll be faithful to the worship assemblies and Bible classes, and we're going to let the Lord live in our house. We'll talk openly of Jesus through our days. That's a Christian home. Love doesn't rejoice in iniquity, it rejoices in the truth. It bears all things. I will not divorce you unless you force me by your adultery. Love bears all things. You know, you were before that preacher and you said, promise to, in sickness and in health, in adversity and prosperity, and forsaking all others, to be faithful to you and to you only until death do us part. Bears all things means that there will be some challenges in our marriage. There will be some hard days. But I'm sticking with you. You know, you can leave me anytime you want, but I'm coming with you. Right? Bears all things. It believes all things. This is one of my favorite in the whole list. You need to put it in your marriage. Believes all things means that I believe the best about you. I believe the best about your character and who you really are. And even when you do something that's wrong, I know that it's wrong, but I'm going to hold out as long as I can with this idea that this is an exception to who you are. It's not really who you are. It's an exception to the rule. This isn't indicative of your real character or your real heart. It's outside of that, and I know that. I want my wife to look at me that way. When I do something wrong, I don't want her to identify me by that action. I want her to look at me and know that that's something outside of who I am. I did something wrong. I'm sorry for it, but it doesn't define me. Love believes all things. It hopes all things. One of the assignments I give to couples who are having trouble, I like to do this, but sometimes it's very effective, is that I want you to barter and find some Christian family to trade off with babysitting so that you can have a date. I want you to have a date. And the subject of this date is that we're going to talk about future plans. I want you to dream together of places that you'd like to go, maybe after the children are grown, of things that you'd like to do, things that you'd like to see, things that you'd like to do together in your life. It's pretty effective. It makes you warm up to each other. Hopes all things. And then the last one is, love endures all things. Now, don't you think it's interesting that in a chapter about love, that is, you think about love as being sweet and pleasant and all of that. Well, that's fine, but he ends up with endures all things. Now, you tell me, what does endures all things have to do with loving somebody? Well, if you've been married very long, you know exactly what that means. And God help us. We have to be people who love our spouses despite the fact that they're imperfect, despite the fact that sometimes they do things that frustrate us, despite the fact that it doesn't always go my way. You want to truly love someone? Do you want to really love someone? What I'm saying to you is that we have commandment to love our spouses, and then we have 1 Corinthians 13 to say, here's what it's like. What's it like? Love suffers long and is kind. Love envies not. It's not puffed up. Does not behave itself unseemly. Seeks not her own. Is not easily provoked. Thinks no evil. Rejoices not in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth. Bears all things. Believes all things. Hopes all things. Endures all things. You've been very kind to listen, and I'm grateful. It's a simple fact that you can't have a Christian home if you're not a Christian. Now, I want to encourage anybody in this room who hasn't obeyed the gospel to do that today. We've got everything ready for you. And wouldn't it be something if today you could give your spouse, who already is a Christian, the greatest gift of all, We're going to construct a Christian home, and today is the first step of that because I'm going to obey the gospel. Repent of your sins and confess His sweet name, and we'll immerse you into Christ. If you need to ask today for the prayers of this congregation, now would be a great time to do that, and perhaps in reference to your home to be the best husband, a better wife, and we will pray and encourage you. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. If you'd like to respond, come as we stand and sing.
Rise up, O men.